For the first part of this lecture, I'm going to be looking at the work of Heather Menzies, who builds on McLuhan's ideas about the global village and is extremely critical, and we'll be looking at that. So in your textbook on page 370, Mann writes, Heather Menzies is an independent scholar and political activist who has followed in the tradition of Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan, and George Grant, the trio of great Canadian theorists of technology and communications. And so this is where she started out. By this point in her career where we are today, she's shifted somewhat. She's looking more at reconciliation and treaty rights. So she's definitely part of the Canadian kind of ongoing debate about various issues. So this is where she's landing now. And she wrote a very original book called Return of the Commons, which I can talk about in a bit. But so he says that she likens the changes through technology to the Industrial Revolution. So that is worth thinking about. Are we living through a period that's just as impactful as the Industrial Revolution was? You obviously have your own opinion on that. But she's arguing that it's changing how we work, it's changing how we shop, it's changing us on all these levels. And he notes, Menzies echoes Marx, arguing that the computerized, globalized economy is turning full-time jobs into part-time temporary McJobs. So this has been an ongoing issue, and I was looking into the stats, and I think it's around 25% now in Canada that work in some ways they intersect with the gig economy, which is very problematic because, as you will know, they don't offer benefits. They often aren't regulated by labor law. They kind of live in the Wild West, a lot of like Uber and all of these kind of disrupting industries. So we can talk about that. But so Heather Menzies is a social critic, and we're going to look at her background a little bit now. So Menzies was born in 1949, and she taught for 20 years at Carleton University in Ottawa. She's actually still on their website, so I don't know if she's perhaps still doing online teaching for them in Canadian studies. On her own website, she describes herself as a seeker, writer, and speaker. So we can see here she's gone beyond even an engaged academic. She's more of an activist, and a writer. So she's won a number of writing awards for her work. So her work is focused on how Canadian society is being shaped by and responding to social, political, and economic forces, such as post-industrialization, globalization, and reconciliation. So throughout her long career, she's been adapting and changing and speaking to issues that are important within Canada, and I really appreciate that your textbook is looking at her work, and this is the great advantage of using a Canadian textbook. We actually look at Canadian thinkers who are speaking specifically to Canadian issues as she does. I want to establish the larger context for the thinkers that we're looking at in this section, and I also want to really highlight, I think it's happening less than it used to, but certainly when I was an undergraduate, there was always this sort of equation of Canada with the US or the UK, or that we're sort of the US and the UK writ small kind of thing. But in fact, when we look at the history, Canada has been developing very differently than both of them. Obviously, we're influenced, but so let's just look at some of the facts here. So all around the world, certainly the Western world, the 1980s began an era of deregulation and privatization in the UK and the US. So this idea of deregulating the banks, and we know that this eventually leads to the crash of 2007, 2008 that almost took down the whole world economy. And so there's a lot more critique of this now. If we look back in the 80s, I remember people saying, you can't fight it, it's just how it is, which is, of course, rhetoric. There's nothing that's just a given. Everything is the product of politics. And so in the 1980s, particularly in the US and the UK, we see deregulation, so the business sector of the banks. We also see privatization, so of things like in Britain of the railway. And so this is sort of the movement towards what's been called laissez-faire capitalism, which takes us right back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So laissez-faire capitalism was always the dream of the bourgeoisie, if we want to use Marxist language, the people that own everything. It's great for them because they can do whatever they want. And so the rhetoric of free trade has always been and continues to be that the market can just regulate itself. The governments don't need to play a role. They should just leave business alone, and business it'll all figure itself out. So you may have heard of this, the idea of the invisible hand that is taken from, I don't know if he meant it that way, but from Adam Smith, the economist Adam Smith. So many people have pointed out that this belief in the invisible hand is a bit like belief in Santa Claus. So none of us are seeing its work. In fact, when banks are deregulated, we get things like 2007 and people lose their homes and lose their pensions. So this is the early heady days when people saw it coming, but a lot of people were buying into this. And so we see the incredible power of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And I lived through this and I saw it. So the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund would be going into countries in Africa and basically telling them they had to get rid of their social safety net if they wanted to get loans. And so putting them in this Faustian bargain, foisting it on them. And the great thinker Vandana Shiva said that they were the second coming of Columbus, just another form of neo-colonization. And so unions are directly attacked at this time in the UK and the United States. I also remember this very clearly. And the most famous case is in the UK with the coal miners' strike, where Margaret Thatcher actively sought to break the coal miners' union. And in the United States, the air traffic controllers was a very similar case. And Thatcher and Reagan were like ideologically best buddies. And so they both sort of sung from the same hymn book of privatization, deregulation, and attacking unions. And so again, we have to be careful here because this doesn't happen in the same way in Canada, and there's many possible reasons for that. I think one of the reasons, it has nothing to do with particular virtue. I think I'll use Canadian Northland, the bus company and train company, for an example. They simply can't run without government money. The Canadian population is too spread out. So if you want to have transportation that gets to all Canadians, it has to have government subsidy. So I think that had an impact on how it plays out in Canada. I do think there are ideological differences as well, as we've been seeing over the last year or so. So, because we've been forced to clarify that by the situation we're currently in with the United States. So the impact of this hollowing out, that should just say the impact of the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector in Canada and the US, that was felt equally in Canada. And so you're too young to even remember any of this, but under NAFTA, that was first negotiated, free trade with the United States, Mexico, and Canada. We saw in Canada used to have a huge manufacturing sector in Ontario, things like clothing, all sorts of things that we actually made here. And after NAFTA, it was completely hollowed out because, of course, people will go where the labor is cheaper and where there's no regulation. And so it had a huge negative impact on Canadian manufacturing, and it has yet to recover. It's going to be interesting to see if the current climate moves us back towards looking at this seriously. I mean, I've always been trying to buy Canadian, but it can be very difficult, as I'm sure some of you know, to even find it because of this precise reason. So nonetheless, Canada continued to regulate its banks, and this was what saved us. And I remember they were under incredible pressure from the business community to deregulate because this financial sector in places like the UK and the United States were raking in huge amounts of money. And they held strong to Canadian tradition, and they kept regulating the banks. And so when 2008 came along, Canada got hit by the recession. Everybody did, because the American economy it caused shock waves through the world. but Canada was able to right itself very quickly. As far as I know, we didn't see the same foreclosures on houses as they did in the United States, where there were millions of them. And we also see that the rates of unionization remain at around 30% in Canada. So there were attacks on the union sector, but it has managed to keep quite strong. And I was looking into some statistics that in the world, 155 million people are covered by a collective agreement. The country with the largest, highest rate of unionization is Iceland, and unsurprisingly, a lot of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries. And then Canada and Ireland are up near the top as well, and the UK remains quite strong in this sector. However, the US went from 1983 from 20% down to just over 10% as it stands now, and under direct attack in the United States right now. So I say this as somebody who's been in a union pretty much not all of my adult life, but a lot of my adult life. And so what you find with unions is a protection of workers. It also, wherever there's unions, it pushes up wages. So even if you're not in a union, the fact that there are unions around generally results in wages being higher. So we can see here that the Canadian context is different, but is getting buffeted by the same forces that are impacting the rest of the Western world. I'm using Douglas Mann's subheading here from page 370 because I think it's funny. And I've added in Jeff Bezos' yacht because I have my own issues with Jeff Bezos. So roadkill on the information superhighway and Jeff Bezos' yacht. So how will I connect these two? Let's just see. So Menzies' early work develops McLuhan's idea as a techno-skeptic. So she and McLuhan would have been among the few that were skeptical about technology. I have seen this in my own lifetime, this incredible naivete about social media and who's controlling it and who it's for and its impacts, and this strange utopian notion that technology is going to solve all of our problems, which we need only look at history and see that no, it just actually creates new problems generally. And so Menzies would have been an outlier, and I do wonder if it impacted her career of being such an outlier at that time. Certainly there are many more techno-skeptics now. I think I mentioned there's a Facebook employee that wrote a book talking about the fact that people who work high up in Facebook don't let their children use social media. So they know what they're doing. And so she argued that increasingly the online world is driving the economy and resulting in part-time labor, which is now called the gig economy. And certainly this is true. We talked about the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector and the way that companies like Uber often they don't always succeed, but they try to skirt any form of labor law wherever they set up business. And in terms of Jeff Bezos, I don't know. He doesn't seem to get the criticism you would think he would get, and you're going to need to help me out. Do we just worship rich people and so we don't ask questions? Because Amazon is notorious for its appalling labor practices and union busting. So I'm always puzzled why people are so fascinated with this. So, for instance, when he got married or remarried recently, there was all these things in magazines about him and his multi-million-dollar wedding, which just seemed, the way the world is right now, just seemed like an insult. So he's just one version of this, but certainly he supports Menzies' idea of the Silicon Curtain. So she argues that the world is dividing to those who control the internet and those who don't. So Bezos came up with this idea of online shopping, and during COVID, it just went through the roof. So he's a bazillionaire. And so you can see the division, and we know this is happening now. She was very prophetic in this regard, that the people like the Musks of the world and the Bezoses of the world are wealthier than the wealthiest robber baron ever was in the Gilded Age. So we're seeing incredible amounts of income disparity in North America now. So almost 25% of Canadians now participating in the gig economy. So I mentioned that already. And so, what implications does this have for um, people being able to, have the basics of life, maybe, hopefully own a home? We already know that we're facing intense pressure in Canada with housing prices, but if you have a gig economy job, there is no way you're going to be able to afford even the basics. So it wasn't quite as bleak as she predicted because other jobs did develop as a result, but we certainly did see the shift from manufacturing economy to service economy, things like hotels and restaurants and so on. So this has a direct impact on American politics. Many have argued that the current political scene we're seeing in the United States is directly the result of globalization and the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. If we see where Trump draws his support, it's often from that area where people have been generationally unemployed. So as somebody said, the apocalypse already came to that area. And then as a result of 2007, many people lost faith in the government as a result of losing their homes and their pensions. So you get a sort of perfect storm in the United States in that case. So Menzies is drawing attention to all of these changes and saying we need to look at this critically and not accept the rhetoric of the beautiful global village that is being touted by the mainstream media. In 2005, Menzies' book No Time: Stress and the Crisis of Modern Life is published, and so again she's developing her ideas about the impact of the internet. And as he writes on page 372 of your textbook, she published her provocative No Time, Stress, and the Crisis of the Modern Life, a book very much in line with the sped-up spirit of our times. And so he says that it results in the compression of time and space due to modern means of travel and communication, work pressures, and technological advances as a basic quality of the postmodern era. And so he goes on to say, yet according to Menzies, the speeding up of time and swallowing of space isn't all that it's chalked up to be. So that whole idea of we can travel where we want, we can work, we can do things 24/7. First of all, we can't travel wherever we want, and the vast majority of the world doesn't travel at all. So again, it's only a certain group of people, elite people, who are going to be benefiting from this. So she notes how today more and more people complain about having no time for the things that once upon a time they enjoyed doing, having conversations, reading a book, going to a movie. There are two principal culprits for this lack of time: modern technology. She mentions email, cell phones, and the internet, and modern work pressures created by employers and public institutions that expect more productivity out of workers in the same amount of time. As a result, life seems to have sped up, and more people are facing stress and burnout. So there's many ways of getting at this, and certainly she's put her finger on something. It's something that I've noticed. Partly it's virtue signaling, let's just be honest about it. I talked about this with different classes of mine, that when people say they're super busy, it's a way of signaling how, you're important and you're doing so many things, right? So I don't know how much of it is a psychological perception and how much of it is true, but it almost doesn't matter. If people are feeling stressed, then that's a real thing. But I do think she's right that if we look at constant inundation of emails, I know for me it's stressful just looking at them, and most of them are just garbage, or they've somehow got into your email willy-nilly. And then you have to delete them. It's very, very exhausting, the whole thing. And so all of this was sort of presented to us like this was going to be so liberating. We're going to be able to talk to people all around the world. And yes, absolutely, that is true. And some of that is absolutely amazing. But a lot of it has also created a huge amount of stress. And so we see this phenomenon that sociologist Etzioni talks about, where he says the internet doesn't have a Sabbath. It doesn't have a holiday. So this idea that when things go online, there's no kind of weekends. People can work all the time. And we all know those stories or have known people, or maybe we've been those people who are working when they're on vacation, because you can do it from your computer. So we've been seeing more and more businesses actually making it a rule that you can't log in on the weekends, which I think is really interesting. So there's been a recognition. It's taken a long time for this to sort of sink in, but she was again ahead of her time here in recognizing the ways in which the internet was changing how we socialize. We're seeing, I've given you that as a possible topic, this what's been called the loneliness epidemic. And I had some pushback in my intro class last term where people were like, we just socialize differently. And that may be true for some people, but the statistics are telling us that people are not socializing. They're not going out. They're not going to parties. And so they're sitting on their phones. And even when they go out together, they're on their phones. So we're seeing how the internet has fundamentally changed society and how we relate to one another. At this point, I want us to engage directly with your textbook because he's talking smack about you. So I'd be interested to get your feedback on this. So he writes on page 374, as all university instructors today know, students seem motivated to attend class and do work only if it affects their grades. They become shameless consequentialists, mark hogs, whatever that means. Today, students suffer from memory deficit. This is caused by a number of factors: the reliance on computers as an external memory, their distraction by various technologies, laptops, cell phone, electronic organizers, portable digital music players. That's absolutely true. This is just a constant battle for me when I'm in class to deal with this. Information overload, a sense of learning as assembling and downloading bits of information without connecting everything together. So here's an example of Marshall McLuhan's theory. So the medium is the message. The fact that people are so used to they use AI or Google or whatever to get these little factoids. And so that becomes the way they want their information given to them. So I think I may have used this example of sometimes I get complaints that I don't use a lot of bullet points because that's how people are used to getting their information. So you can see the way technology is shaping people's consciousness and the way that they want to be given information. And what we lose in that, as I think I mentioned, is all the context, all the nuance that goes around that. So that has real consequences. However, I don't think he's being completely fair here about the whole Marx thing. So let's just skip ahead to the end where he gives a picture of a student. And again, I'm going to ask you what you think of this. So page 383, run, Jessica, run. It's 12:10 on a crisp September day. Jessica McMillan has 20 minutes to run across campus, buy a coffee and sandwich for lunch, go to the lecture hall for her technology and values class, very funny, then get her panoply of gadgets set up for class. As she trots across the central commons, her laptop is open and working, her Wi-Fi connection and Facebook page active all the way. Her leaping and Facebooking across campus causes her to miss the V-wing of Canada geese flying overhead, honking as they head south for the winter, along with the 100 or so students gathered in front of the community center for a Free Palestine demonstration. She does, however, notice Jennifer Jackson texting someone on her cell phone in front of the social science building. Some of this is true. I'm sure you've all been in the hallway when people are texting and they're just like an army of zombies. Sorry, Jess, no time, says Jessica, giving Jen a jovial wink. She feels slightly annoyed at having to talk to Jennifer, a person she barely knows in real life. After all, it's taken the best part of a minute of her precious time. Okay, and so it goes on. So he's offering a picture of the modern day student, the contemporary student. I'll ask you to read that, and then I want you to comment on the discussion posts what you think about this. Is this an accurate picture of you and your brethren? I'm going to say, as somebody who teaches, this is not fair. Some of it is fair. We are definitely seeing the way technology has impacted learning. Absolutely, we are. We're in an online class here, but my experience has been that every generation of students is just as concerned about, when I ask questions about meaning and purpose and all of these deeper questions, I find people very engaged, and so I think he's exaggerating here. So I'll be very interested to know if you see this as a reflection of yourself. Are you not looking at the Canadian geese? Because you should be looking at them. It's very beautiful when they fly back. I'm waiting for them to fly back. I'm so sick of the snow right now. And so yeah, let me know. Let me know. Is he right or is he wrong or is he partially right? In 2014, Menzies published quite a different type of work called Reclaiming the Commons for the Common Good. And we can see her political engagement here, the idea of the common good. And it's striking to me that these kind of works that try to imagine a new world, try to imagine an alternative to the one we're in, get very little traction often in the mainstream reviews and so on. Whereas the guys that we're going to look at next get so much attention. So I don't know if that's just a negativity bias of the people that say everything's garbage, just get more attention. I don't know. But this work is Menzies trying to actually imagine a new way of being that doesn't destroy the environment. So on her website, she says, commenting was a way of life for most of our ancestors. So again, many people have said going back to this land ethic, and I have taught on the environment and religion many times, and I agree with her here, that it is a form of reconciliation because everybody would have had this kind of, or vast majority of people would have had this kind of relationship with the land prior to the Industrial Revolution because you depended on the land, so you couldn't abuse it or you would starve to death. So she says, commenting was a way of life for most of our ancestors. So I did touch on this earlier, that prior to the Industrial Revolution, during the feudal period, there were often pasture lands in common, land in common that everybody would share. And so she's drawing on this idea. So author Heather Menzies journeys to her roots in the Scottish Highlands, where her family lived in direct relation with the land since before recorded time. And so beginning with an intimate account of unearthing the heritage of the commons and the real tragedy of its loss. So she's going back into her own personal history, sort of Scottish history. So I think I also mentioned that when there was the enclosure of the Highlands, it displaced many, many people, many of whom moved to places like Canada to get land because they lost all their land. And so she's going back to sort of the time before that enclosure. So Menzies offers a detailed description of the self-organizing, self-governing, and self-informing principles of this nearly forgotten way of life, including its spiritual practices and traditions. Okay, so this is going back to kind of traditional ways of being on the land and understanding the land as sacred. And also, there are many iterations of this that continue. I went to a workshop many years ago now, but talking about there's the sort of money economy, but there's many other economies that exist. And so I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's a thing called, and there's versions of this, but it's called free cycles. So you can do it online. Some people just do it through sort of posting notices. But if somebody needs something and you have it, you just give it to them. So I know many people who did this, they just put it, the person says, I want a popcorn maker, and you have one and you don't want it anymore, you just put it in your garage and you let them have it. So this sharing economy, this already exists. We know this between friends and family. People do this all the time. It's so common we don't even think about it. But in fact, that is the commons, that's sharing. And so this is a way of undercutting capitalism in that sense that the way it's with nuclear families and even people living alone now, it's like everybody needs a lawnmower, everybody needs a snowblower, everybody needs everything, one of each. So this is the idea of sharing. And so there's many versions of this. In some places, libraries actually have like tools that you can book out for like a day, things like that. So I do want to note that this isn't something from the misty past. This continues to exist. It's just very, very rarely written about, and so you can see that this is an idea that is gaining traction. Menzies' latest publication is Meeting My Treaty Kin, A Journey Toward Reconciliation, and I found a very detailed review of this book in the British Columbia Quarterly. I believe Menzies has moved to British Columbia. So Andrew Martindale writes, non-Indigenous Canada's gradual and reluctant reckoning with its violent and criminal colonial history is a tortuous path. Despite considerable available evidence, many non-Indigenous people remain ignorant, perhaps willfully so, of this history and its ongoing processes and effects. Heather Menzies' book presents an intriguing example of one person's attempt to arrive at an understanding of colonialism, and one that explores the more difficult inner path that asks, how am I implicated in this history and what might I do? So we can see she's grappling. So the Commons book was more about the positive aspects of her own heritage, but this is looking at, and this cuts right to the bone for many of us, that her family, coming from Scotland, got land grants on First Nation territory. This is true for my family too, and probably most of your families. So she's trying to engage with it through a kind of a personal memoir. And the review is very, it's an academic review, and so it's also critical of her. And so it notes that she doesn't get very into the economics and the sort of economics exploitation. It's much more sort of personal. But we can see that Menzies has her interest. She's followed her interests throughout her long publishing career. And so along with the rest of us, she's trying to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings. So in the final part of this chapter, we come to the two men who are the shining stars of neo-Marxism. And so he says, our third topic in this chapter is a complex theoretical structure built by the dynamic duo of Antonio Negri, an Italian political theorist and left-wing activist, and Michael Hart, an American literature professor. Now, that paper's over some material. So when you look into the biography of Antonio Negri, he was jailed numerous times. I think he was charged with kidnapping and then got off the charge and then was taken back. And so we've got a Gramsci type situation going on. So the Italians are not fooling around, clearly. And so he comes out of that same foment that the French thinkers come out of in the late 60s, early 70s. And then Michael Hart is a literature professor. So like McLuhan, it's interesting where these thinkers come, what disciplines they come out of. And actually, Edward Said, who wrote one of the most influential texts on colonialism, was a literature professor. So that shouldn't be that surprising, I guess. So Mann goes on to say that they center on the notion of empire, the title of their much-discussed 2000 book. It is difficult to sort out individual contributions between Hart and Negri, but it would appear that Hart is Engels to Negri's Marx, a translator and polisher of his ideas with a solid grasp of historical facts. Indeed, Empire, their magnum opus, fluctuates between fairly lucid historical passages on the history of capitalism and theoretical explorations of philosophical issues written in so turgid and obscure a manner they'd make Hegel blush. So, okay, bit of a mixed review. So he's basically saying that Hart is the person who's trying to make it more legible for us to read. And certainly he was successful because the books were extremely popular. So like McLuhan, they're among the few that actually break through into kind of mainstream readership. So the big breakthrough book for these two was called Empire, which is a great title. I have great admiration for a good title. And so on page 375, Mann says, Negri and Hart's reimagining of the global village as a vast global empire makes a nice counterpoint to McLuhan's more benign picture of the New World Order. So he's juxtaposing McLuhan, that's at the beginning of the chapter, who I don't know how benign McLuhan's, again, it can be difficult to get at in his writing, but as I said, he was a techno-skeptic, so I think that might be an overstatement. But anyway, a vast global empire makes a nice counterpoint to McLuhan's more benign picture of the New World Order. Empire is structured with a backbone of political theory, from which branch out ribs of history, economics, sociology, and cultural theory. Negri and Hart's influences are diverse. First and foremost, they are Marxist, historical materialists who somewhat apologetically champion the coming of communism. So he goes on and gives some of the other influences here that you can read. So then he gives the picture, sort of the overarching picture of the book. We live in an age of globalization, so we've talked about that already in this lecture, those changes, deregulation, laissez-faire capitalism. where economic and cultural exchanges in the global market have given rise to postmodern capitalism and a new global order with a new form of political rule or sovereignty named empire. This replaces in part the sovereignty of the nation state, which is in decline. Empire is the name Negri and Hart give to the political power that regulates global exchanges that governs the world. Okay, so this is getting at the things like the IMF, the World Bank, that these forces and the businesses behind them, the corporations behind them, are the real powers in the world. Now, I think you're probably aware this hasn't aged particularly well because we're clearly in a time where the nation state is resurgent for a wide variety of reasons, and probably because of this globalization. We're seeing a real backlash against it. We saw it with Britain leaving the European Union. We're seeing it with Canadian patriotism. So this is more like a snapshot of what was going on at the time. And this is what sometimes happens with these kind of books. They become dated very quickly. But it's still it's an interesting way of looking at the world. And so he's included a pyramid there of how the writers understand power in the world. So again, the USA at the apex. And again, this is questionable because many people are saying it's the end of empire. So there's a lot of that kind of language going around. Who knows? It's too early to tell. So they refer to America as a global cop, so the sort of the policeman of the world. Well, they're trying. We'll see if they're successful. So he talks on page 379 about immaterial labor, postmodern capitalism, and the multitude. So this is more getting into the books that follow. So we'll turn to them now. So their next book, there's a trilogy that they're most associated with, is Multitude, and it builds on the arguments being made in Empire. And I was happy to see it's a reasonable length because one of the other similar books that came out in 2013 called Capital by Piketty is 816 pages. It's like, what are you trying to do to us here? That was a bestseller, by the way. So periodically these books, as I said, break through and become bestsellers. So in Multitude, we're told by Goodreads that has fear become our permanent condition and democracy an impossible dream? Such pessimism is profoundly mistaken, the authors argue. Empire, by interconnecting more areas of life, is actually creating the possibility for a new kind of democracy, allowing different groups to form a multitude with the power to forge a democratic alternative to the present world order. Exhilarating in its optimism and depth of insight, Multitude consolidates Hart and Negri's stature as two of the most important political philosophers at work in the world today. So your textbook is much more critical of them, and I have to say I do agree with him here that they're postulating a sort of a new version of the proletariat, but it has the exact same problem that Marx and Engels ran into. It's how do you organize this mass of people? What levers are you using? So traditionally it's the nation state, or in traditional Marxism it might be the unions. But if you're just talking about masses of people on the internet, that doesn't seem workable as a political movement. So Men correctly asks how exactly were they planning that this was going to come about. So part of the argument that he talks about on page 379 is that we've seen a crisis in the institutions of civil society, churches, schools, hospitals, labor unions, and the traditional family. Once a mediator between the state and the excesses of capitalism, civil society has been flattened out into the circuits of control and network society. So again, I ask you to think about that. Do you think that's true? Do you think we've seen a breakdown in these institutions? Some of them are under strain, I would say, but the jury's out on that. They do make some really interesting points, though, about the post-industrial economy. So what they call immaterial labor has achieved a hegemonic or dominant status. So I wanted to use a YouTuber as an example of that. Sort of what they're peddling is completely immaterial. It's just sort of ideas and feelings on the internet. And some of them become very, very wealthy as a result. So they're a good example of the ways in which Hart and Negri are actually making really important point here. Now, their optimism about the masses or the multitude, I'm not as clear. Certainly, it goes against the grain of traditional forms of political organizing, which tends to be much more local. So we're going to move on to the third book in the trilogy. So the final book in the trilogy is called Commonwealth, and you can see it's a similar concept to what Menzies was looking at, although this one got far more attention, as I said. So drawing on scenarios from around the globe and elucidating the themes that unite them, Hart and Negri focus on the logic of institutions and the models of governance adequate to our understanding of global commonwealth. They argue for the idea of the common to replace the opposition of private and public and the politics predicated on that opposition. Ultimately, they articulate the theoretical basis for what they call governing the revolution. So they're Marxists, so they have to talk about the revolution. So they're actually saying similar things, getting a lot more attention because they're publishing with Harvard Press about returning to things held in common rather than private property, which, as the Marxists argue, is the basis of our capitalist economy. So in his critique at the end of the chapter on page 382, Mann says, having produced such an ambitious and politically committed analysis of the new world order we live in, Negri and Hart have opened themselves up to a whole slew of criticism. First, the claimed decline of the nation state is greatly exaggerated, right? So I already touched on that. If anything, it's resurgent. Second, empire can be accused of using confusing rhetoric about circulation and hybridity without spelling out the concrete consequences of these notions. Third, Negri and Hart are too quick to embrace intellectual fads of the day. So these are his critiques. And so, these are very utopian, again, ideas. So calling for world citizenship. I don't know about that. So again, I all I'm asking for you is to engage with it. So I don't think that's how humans function. I just don't think. I think there's maybe 3 people on Earth that think of themselves as a world citizen. We're much more regionally based. We're much more community embedded. I think this is just a not understanding of that. That kind of abstracting people out of their communities is problematic. I agree with him here, but certainly the idea of the common is a very compelling way of looking at this, and I agree with a lot of their critique. But again, we're sort of all brainstorming regarding solutions to how we can change this. And so, if you are interested in this work, as I said, you can read one of these books and do a close analysis for your final essay.